At this point in any journey through the Bible, when we come to Genesis chapter 37, what may be called the personal history of the patriarchs ends. It ends with Jacob. And now it's going to start merging into more of a history of the children of Israel. And that means of the family of Jacob, the tribes after that. And the purpose of God with the patriarchs as individuals had really been fulfilled when Jacob became the father of the 12. And at this point, as I said a couple of weeks ago, it narrows down to one man, his son, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons. Or we might say his son, his grandson, and his great-grandsons. At this point, that man was going to be Jacob's son. Really, the rest of the book of Genesis covers more or less the period of Jacob's authority. Isaac, that's why Isaac's death was recorded already. Even though he technically hadn't died yet, his death is sort of ahead of time, in advance recorded, because he is no longer the main head of the family, but Jacob is. And the rest of the book of Genesis is really the umbrella of Jacob's patriarchy, even though Jacob is not the main character anymore. His son is going to be the main character. But we have to look back very briefly to God's promise to Abraham, back in Genesis 15. We may not have even looked at it in detail when we were at Genesis 15. But here's one of the times that God spoke to Abraham. He said this, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So this is when Abraham goes to the land of Canaan. God speaks to him again and says, I'm giving you this land, your descendants. But there's an asterisk. Your offspring are first going to have to be sojourners in a land that's not theirs, and they're going to be slaves there, servants and ultimately slaves, for 400 years. And then they'll come back here in the fourth generation. And he says the reason is because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, it is not yet time for me to bring a reckoning on the people of this land. But when that time comes, it's going to happen. But in the meantime, your descendants are going to be going to a land that's not theirs. That's not this land, in other words. And they're going to be servants there. The land that was not theirs is Egypt. And the rest of Genesis contains the record of how God began this 400-year sojourn with one man, Joseph. That started with one man. We all know what comes next when they leave Egypt. But how'd they get to Egypt? That's what's about to be recorded here in the life of Joseph. And we're going to look at this basically as a study and a look of the character and life of Joseph. And as, I guess, as briefly as we possibly can. When we think of the patriarchs, we might think of, the three Abraham. How many times is God called the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? We think of Abraham. He's the father of the faith, the father of the faithful. Isaac is sort of the son of promise. We think of Jacob as the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And yet, think about Joseph, the son of Jacob. He was the next one, the next in the line, you might say, or at least in the patriarchy, the chosen one of his father. More space is devoted to Jacob in Genesis or Joseph than any other. Chapter 37, all the way through the end, all about Joseph, all of it. Even though it's Jacob's the patriarch, Joseph's the main character. And if you think about it, Joseph is in a way, it's borderline, but in a way, he is one of those very few Bible characters about whom there's not a single word of explicit rebuke in the text. Explicit. I'll put that caveat there. Explicit. We can interpret maybe a thing or two as questionable. But there's no, with Abraham, we read about how he went and lied to Pharaoh, and Isaac did the same thing to Abimelech, with Abimelech, and Jacob, certainly is not without fault in the narrative about him. But Joseph's different. Something's different about Joseph. His character is worthy of reflection and careful study and imitation. His nobility, his purity in heart and life, and his the way he ruled and even treated his brothers later in his life, as we'll see. More than any other Old Testament character, it could be said that Joseph illustrates the type of man that Christ can give to the world. Whenever people follow Jesus, you could almost say that of all the Old Testament characters, at least up to this point, he shows this kind of character, even, right up there with Abraham. So let's look at the life of Joseph, which is really the rest of the rest of the book of Genesis. Be reminded of some of the things. We see him first as a son in Canaan. In Genesis 37, by the way, Genesis 38 is sort of a detour. I'll say some more about that in just a second. But in Genesis 37, Joseph we see him as a son, his father's son in Canaan. We read that he was his father's favorite, which is never ideal, not a good thing. It's not uncommon at this point. Isaac and Rebekah certainly played favorites. Now Jacob is playing favorites with his sons. We might say the reasoning is justified in that Joseph was for a while the only son of his beloved wife Rachel, the woman that he seemingly intended to make his only wife, got tricked along the way. But he would always remain the firstborn of his beloved Rachel. That doesn't excuse, unjust favoritism. Nevertheless, Joseph was his favorite. He was even given this special robe that for some reason, somebody started calling a coat of many colors. Well, the word, just in passing, it was not a coat, number one, and it wasn't necessarily of many colors. But somewhere, somebody started describing this thing as a coat of many colors. It was just a robe that had long sleeves and was worn by princes and such, that was probably intended to convey that Joseph is my next. I'm choosing Joseph. Forget that he's not the firstborn, not even the second or third or fourth born, or fifth or sixth born. He's the one. But we also read that his brothers hated him. His brothers absolutely hated him. And it's hard to really say how much Joseph himself may have contributed to that hatred. We see a couple of little hints that he was what some people might call a snitch. He went and tattled on his brothers to his dad. This may have been a regular thing. He gave them a bad report. He gave Jacob a bad report of his brothers. Maybe that had something to do with their hatred. But they were mainly jealous of him. We also learned that some of the things that Joseph told them made them hate him even more. Because what we read is that Joseph had two dreams, both of which indicated he was superior, or would be. And he had the nerve to go tell his brothers. Hey, I had a dream. We were out in the field. Your sheaves all bowed down to my sheaves. My sheaves. Had another dream about stars, very similar to that. And from that point it says, they hated him even more. Because they were jealous, but also, it says, because of his words. Favoritism didn't help. His dreams made it worse. Well, as the narrative goes along, his brothers on one occasion were down in Shechem, and Joseph was kept back, it seems, by Jacob. But after some time, he sends Joseph down to check on his brothers. And his brothers see him coming, and they say, "Oh, here comes that dreamer. Why don't we just go ahead and kill him?" So they plot to kill him. That is, all of them except one. Reuben, the oldest. Reuben. We sort of get a soft spot for Reuben in all of this, even though we also kind of want to kick him a little bit for not being stronger. He didn't say, "No, that's ridiculous and evil, we're not doing this." But he said, instead of killing him, the plan was, let's kill him and throw his body in this well. Instead of killing him and throwing his body in the well, why don't we just throw him in the well? And the text tells us that Reuben's plan was to come back later and rescue him and take him back to Dad. But they go through with this. They throw him down there. Reuben apparently leaves for something. They're eating. Joseph's down in the well, a dry well, probably crying out for help. I mean, please don't stop. Please get me out of here. They're up there eating lunch. Some Ishmaelites start coming down the road. They say, "Hey, why don't we get him out of there instead of him starving to death?" This was Judah's idea. "We'll just sell him to these Ishmaelites. Make some money. Might as well." See, Judah didn't know Reuben had a plan to come and save him later. So Judah has this idea, and they like that idea. So they sell him to the Ishmaelites. But first they take his special robe and dress it up in a way that is to deceive their father into thinking that he's been killed by a wild animal. And that's what they did. They took the coat or the robe. They put some blood on it. They they take it back to their father Jacob and tell him that he's been killed. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? That it wasn't too long ago, probably was, in real time, Jacob pulled a similar kind of prank and stunt against his own father to trick him into thinking something that wasn't true, to steal a blessing from him. But anyway, might be a lesson there that sin has ways sometimes of coming back to haunt us, coming back around. At any rate, he mourns. But meanwhile, Joseph is taken by the Ishmaelites, also called the Midianites because that's where they were from. Looks like a contradiction, but it's not. They were Ishmaelites because they came from Ishmael genealogically. They were Midianites because they lived in the land of Midian. They take him to Egypt and sell him to an officer of Pharaoh, an Egyptian officer named Potiphar. And what Potiphar means is dedicated to Ra. And Ra is the sun god. And so he was sold to a worshiper of the sun in Egypt. Big old city. Poor Joseph. By the way, Joseph was 17 years old. Forgot to mention that part. 17 years old. He is now taken from his family, taken from his home, sold by the hatred of his brothers for no real doing of his own. Maybe he was a little twerp of a brother at times. Maybe he should have kept his mouth shut about his dreams. But was this really called for? No. But we don't ever read a word of Joseph lashing out against his brothers. No word of him intentionally rubbing it into them like, look, I'm Dad's favorite. What are you going to do about it? Touch me and see what happens. I'll just go tell Dad. You know what he'll do. He don't give me the belt, but he'll give it to you. I know he will. I made all that up, by the way. But chapter 38 takes a little detour that we're not going to take, and that's because it's about Judah and breaks the narrative of Joseph. But I just want to point out the whole purpose of chapter 38 is to give us a record of the birth of the next man in the messianic line, which is Perez or Perez from Judah. He is in the lineage of Jesus. That's the whole point of chapter 38, but it's kind of a rated R chapter. Okay, so either way, we're not going there. We're going to keep following Joseph because next we see Joseph as a slave in Egypt. So he's in Egypt, the big city, big, huge metropolitan city compared to whatever city he was in Egypt, compared to anywhere he had been before, I'm sure. All alone, a teenager, maybe early 20s, but, late teens, probably, in Egypt. He is now, there's a key phrase here. It's really the key to Joseph's life. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 2. And Jehovah was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And then verse 3 says that Potiphar saw that Jehovah was with Joseph, and that Jehovah made all that he did to prosper. Everything Joseph did somehow worked. It turned to his help, blessing, benefit. He succeeded in everything. He's a slave in Egypt, a foreign slave for that matter. But everything turns out to be a success for Joseph. Why? Because God's with him. And why is God with him? Because of his heart, his character, his faith. So Potiphar puts him in charge of everything. He goes from being a slave. He's still a slave, by the way. But he's maybe a little more than a slave because he's a slave that is now over everything in Potiphar's whole household. Potiphar was not Pharaoh, by the way, but he was some sort of high person, high up. It says he was a captain of the guard or something like that. He was an officer of Pharaoh. Now Joseph is over his whole house. The only thing Potiphar had to worry about was what he's going to have for dinner, because Joseph did everything else. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Have somebody to do that for you? Well, that's what Potiphar had for Joseph, because he saw that his God, not his own God, Ra had nothing to do with it. He saw that Jehovah was with Joseph. And Jehovah is pretty good at making people have success. Pretty good at blessing people, it seems. Maybe even more than Ra. I'm speaking from his perspective, of course. Obviously, way more than Ra. Well, Joseph, a teenage young man, is going about his business, serving in the house of Potiphar. Potiphar's wife starts making advances at him. You know why? We learned something about Joseph in chapter 39. He inherited his mother's good looks. He was, how does it say? He was, we'll just say he was very handsome in form and appearance, to the delight of Potiphar's wife, who was not a good woman, who was not a pure woman. She starts making advances at him. And against all temptation and odds and maybe against what we might assume of a young man, refuses her. And he says he does so, I will not give you what you're asking for because I have respect for my earthly master and for my heavenly master. I'm not going to do this to my master, and I'm not going to sin against God. And what we learn is that this was not a one-time thing, but over and over, repeatedly. Joseph was trapped in temptation, in an area of temptation. You know, the devil has ways of working. He knows us. We all have our own weaknesses. We share some weaknesses, and some weaknesses we have that differ from one another. But Satan has his own realm in our lives, and he cannot get us unless we step into that realm. He can't get us. He can't reach us. Temptation cannot reach us unless we step a little foot into that circle where he has influence over us. That circle is our weaknesses. When we tiptoe into there, and most of the time for us, we do it ourselves. We willingly go into that realm. We flirt with the idea. We allow temptation to come for whatever reason. Subconsciously, maybe sometimes. But that was not the case with Joseph. He was put into this against his will. He can't just leave. His master's wife is the one doing this. Can you imagine some of the excuses and justifications that a teenage boy could have come up with? To go and do what she was wanting to do? Hey, I'm far from home. Nobody will ever know. Nobody knows me here. They don't know who I am. When in the city, right? When in Egypt, it's probably pretty normal. I got a feeling Potiphar's wife had done this before. No big deal. Hey, I can just repent of it later if I regret it. But that's not how Joseph thought. That wasn't his thought process. He did everything he could to stay out. He couldn't get out of the circle of Satan's influence because he was trapped in there. But he did everything he could to stay around the farthest edges of it as he could. And that's what we read about Joseph here. He continually was refusing her. And he tried everything he could to stay as far away from her, to stay away from her. A lot of people in his situation, even if they weren't going to go through with it, they would have. When you know somebody likes you, you're kind of drawn to that person, aren't you? Especially when we're younger. Maybe I shouldn't even say that. It's just a human trait for most people. Joseph knows that Potiphar's wife likes him. So he could have, taken every opportunity to sort of poke that bear, if you will. Winking at her, flirting with her, saying hi to her, in a such a way. But he did everything he could to stay away from her. And that's what we should do. Not just in that exact situation, but temptation at large. Do everything in our power to stay outside of that sphere, that circle, that realm of influence that Satan has, that real estate that Satan has in our lives. Joseph was doing that. But one day, she outsmarted him and had everybody leave. And now he was literally trapped. He's going about his business. I don't know what he was doing. Making some records, I don't know, writing something, or whatever slave work, servant work he was having to do at that moment. Everybody out. And she goes up there to Joseph. Grabs him. And now he's more trapped than he's ever been. Lie with me. And Joseph still doesn't give in. He shakes off his outer garment and hits the door running. Just runs. Didn't even stop to think, because he already had it ingrained in his mind. I'm not going to do this thing. And he ran. Potiphar's wife thought very quick on her feet. This was no dumb woman. She was no dummy. She instantly cried out and accused Joseph of attempted rape, and that he ran off whenever he heard her screaming. And so Potiphar threw him in prison. Now he's a prisoner in Egypt, of no doing of his own. He did even less to deserve this than he had possibly done to deserve going to Egypt in the first place. He is now in prison. By the way, I don't think Potiphar believed his wife, personally, because if you think about it, being thrown in prison under his own dominion for the crime of supposedly having attempted to rape your master's wife is pretty light. I think he knew his wife, and any other man would have been dead. Can't help but also put the providence of God in this. In fact, that's probably the main reason why Joseph was alive at all at this point. He threw him in prison. And then we read these words in chapter 39 near the end. Same words we've seen already. But Jehovah was with Joseph. And he started to find favor with the keeper of the prison. And guess what the keeper of the prison did? Deja vu. He put him over the whole prison. Now Joseph is the head of the prison. So now the keeper of the prison doesn't have to worry about anything because he's got Joseph in charge. Every single thing that man did to Joseph, God turned it around. Not completely. He's still a prisoner. But he turned it to Joseph's good. Joseph is a prisoner. After some time, two of his fellow prisoners have dreams, and he interprets those dreams. And all he asks in return is, put in a good word for me. Well, one of those men was killed, executed, as he said in the interpretation of the dream. The other one was set free, the cupbearer. But the cupbearer leaves, and it says, he did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And 2 whole years passed by. And Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh has this dream, and the cupbearer suddenly remembers. Oh, yeah. There was this guy, Joseph, this prisoner. He interpreted my dream. It came true. Pharaoh gets him. He interprets Pharaoh's dream. And guess what Pharaoh does? The dream, by the way, was very helpful. The interpretation was, because it indicated there was a 7-year famine coming. So Pharaoh releases him from prison and puts him as second in command over the whole country, the whole place. Now it is Pharaoh. He went from Potiphar's second in command to the keeper of the prison in second command. Now he's Pharaoh's second in command. He gave him his signet ring. Joseph was basically the king of Egypt. He had the signet ring. That means whatever he says is from the king, is from Pharaoh. God turned it again. Man keeps mistreating Joseph. Nice guys finish last, but not if God has anything to do with it. Because they keep putting him last, and God keeps lifting him up. Keeps lifting him up because of his integrity, his character. Now we see him as a prince in Egypt. But then guess what? Comes back around. That famine sets in, and we read something that's sort of foreshadowing. All the earth, hyperbolically speaking, came to Joseph for food. Egypt had the food because of Joseph's prophecy. They stored up for those years leading up so they would have food for the famine. Well, now the famine's here. Everybody all around is having to come to Joseph, not just to Egypt, to Joseph. Well, guess what that means? It just so happens Joseph's brothers come to Egypt, to Joseph. They don't know it's Joseph. He looks different. He's a little more grown up, and he probably is dressed like an Egyptian. He's second under Pharaoh. They come, and these are fascinating chapters, by the way. We don't have time to get into all the details. He demands to see his youngest brother, their youngest brother, I should say, because he pretends like he is not Joseph. They don't know who he is. They said they had a younger brother. He said, well, here's the thing. Bring your younger brother here, and then we'll talk. That's the short version. They go. They tell Jacob. Jacob says, absolutely not. How could you possibly have done this to me? But ultimately, there's no other choice. So they go back with Benjamin. Joseph sees him. He weeps privately. He bestows all kinds of honors on Benjamin in front of his brothers. He's putting them to the test. I wonder how they'll act. I wonder how they'll treat Benjamin. If I start giving him all these favors, I'm going to give him, more food, more honor, more praise. But all these tests, his brothers keep passing these tests. Something's different. He again tests his brothers. He frames his brother Benjamin as a thief to see what his brothers would do, which prompts Judah to offer himself in place of Benjamin. You cannot take this brother. Take me instead. Finally, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in, again, one of the most emotional reunions recorded in Scripture. He says, it's me. He forgives them, pardons them, and says, you need to bring Jacob, bring our father, and everybody, all of his, everything. You're moving here. You're coming here. I'm over Egypt. Pharaoh has put me in charge of everything. And you're going to live in this special place, separate. Close, but separate. That he's giving us. Obviously that God had given them. Well, Jacob blesses his sons. He promises Joseph that God will bring their people back to the land of promise. And he dies. And Joseph buries Jacob at the place that he had promised and requested. And then Joseph reassures his brothers and reminds them of God's promises. Joseph, and by the way, his plans and his purposes in them. And after ruling over Egypt for maybe as many as 75 years, or 60, he died at 110. So depending on how old he was when he got there, he was there for a long time. And then he dies. But thanks to the efforts of Joseph and God's providence, Israel spent the next 400 years increasing into a mighty people. But Joseph would not be forgotten. For 400 years, God didn't speak to the people of Israel or that family. Not a word. They were building, increasing, multiplying, just like God had told Abraham way back then in Genesis 15. But the life of Joseph, the character of Joseph, the behavior, the actions of Joseph was a huge part of this legacy. His character, his person, his faith and trust in God, his devotion, even in a foreign land. So many young people go off from home, maybe not even that far. But that sense of freedom, which is a blessing in a way, it can be. It can be a huge part of growing up when done responsibly. But a lot of people leave home, especially if they go off to a city, and they rush to make all their worst decisions that they will ever make for the rest of their life all at once, that they may not ever get over. Not Joseph. Joseph was such a man that he never forgot God. Everywhere he went, He detected God's presence. He felt God's presence. He understood and realized and acknowledged God's, not just His presence, but His doings. God is here. I'm in Canaan. God is here. I'm out over in Shechem with my brothers. God is here. I'm in the bottom of a dry well. God is here. Here I am in a caravan being taken to Egypt against my will. He could probably see his homeland in the distance as he was in that caravan. God's here. Now I'm in Egypt. I know no one. I'm all alone in a place filled with sin and idolatry. But I'm not alone. God's here. And God showed it because Joseph was a faithful, godly man who never forgot, who was really in control. Joseph's a great example for us. He was a great example for the children of Israel. All those 400 years, guess what they had to fall back on? Our father Joseph. You know, he reminded his brothers of God's purposes. Jacob reminded them of the purposes. They would have those promises to feed on all those 400 years of servitude in Egypt. And remember what Joseph had said and Joseph's legacy as a man of God. We look back on Abraham as a father of the faith, and we look at Jacob and some of the great things he did, but look at Joseph. Joseph and his stand against temptation, his success against temptation. The best way to avoid sin is to avoid temptation. And Joseph did everything he could to avoid temptation in a land full of it, full of sin. He saw the big picture and God's wonderful deeds and blessings, no matter where he was, and we should do that as well. Joseph's character should be an example for us, like Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:12, to be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, and in purity. Joseph was that, for sure. And thanks to him, Israel would spend those next 400 years cherishing, growing into a mighty nation, cherishing his example, his leadership, and the promises of God. That's what we read as Exodus begins, until things changed so many years later, and it was time for them to leave. They went in there as one man. Joseph's of Israelite number one in Egypt, and they were going to come out as many as 2 million by some estimates. But how about us? Are we like Joseph? He was just a teenager when he got to Egypt. We may still be trying to get over some of the weaknesses and struggles that we've had our whole lives, not just as a teenager, but even now, so many years later. Let us take his example, take the example of Jesus, of which Joseph is a type. Joseph is a type of Christ in so many ways. Let us follow their example, resist temptation, resist sin, knowing that God is with us as long as we are with him, and that he will turn whatever evil men do to us to good in the end.